If you've ever stood near a busy freight line in America, you've probably seen one. Maybe you didn't know its name, but you remember the vibe, the sound, that work boots look. Long hood, simple lines, no drama, just a locomotive that looks like it's clocking in for a night shift. And that's the twist. Because the diesel that truly took over US railroading wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the flashiest. It wasn't the one rail fans point at and say, "That's the future." It was the SD40-2. And I'm going to say something that sounds almost insulting. The SD40-2 didn't win because it was exciting. It won because it was boring in exactly the right ways. Today I'll show you why the SD40-2 won everything. And I'm going to do it through the lens railroads actually care about. Not horsepower bragging rights, not museum value, but the stuff that keeps freight moving at 2 a.m. in January. Here's the whole story in one sentence. Railroads don't buy power, they buy uptime. And the SD40-2 was basically uptime. With wheels. Now, to keep this tight, I'm giving you the 3 reasons up front, so you know exactly where we're going. Then we'll walk through each one with real-world logic. Reason number 1, standardization. Reason number 2, maintainability. Reason number 3, the kind of enough power that saves money instead of spending it. And by the end, you'll see why the biggest machines don't usually take over. The machines that take over are the ones that make the whole railroad easier to run. The problem railroads were solving, for real. When people talk about locomotives, they usually talk like it's a car show. How many horsepower? How fast? How loud? How iconic? But railroads operate like a logistics company with a steel problem. Their question is painfully simple. How do we move the most tonnage with the fewest surprises for the lowest total cost? And surprises don't mean just breakdowns. Surprises mean anything that throws off the plan. A unit that's down unexpectedly. A part you don't have. A mechanic who needs a special tool. A weird system that only 2 guys in the shop know how to fix. A locomotive that's too unique to swap quickly when you're short on power. That's why the SD40-2 matters. It didn't just pull trains, it reduced surprises. And in freight railroading, reducing surprises is basically printing money. Quick story. The difference between impressive and useful. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're running a railroad and it's Monday morning. Your schedule is stacked. Crews are lined up. Customers are already yelling if you're late. Now you get 2 choices. Choice A is a monster locomotive. Super impressive. When it's running, it's incredible. Choice B is a locomotive that isn't sexy at all. But it starts. Every day. It's predictable. You know what breaks, and you know how to fix it fast. If you're a rail fan, you might choose A. If you're a railroad, you choose B. And you choose B so hard you buy hundreds of them. That's the SD40-2 story. Reason number 1, standardization, the hidden superpower. Here's the first reason the SD40-2 won everything. Standardization. This is the part most people underestimate because it's not fun. But it's the biggest reason a locomotive becomes a national default. When a railroad buys a locomotive model in huge numbers, it's not just buying locomotives. It's buying a system. Training becomes simple. Parts inventories become predictable. Maintenance routines become muscle memory. Troubleshooting becomes fast because you've seen the same failure 1,000 times. And once that system exists, every additional unit gets cheaper to own. That's the snowball effect. The SD40-2 hit the sweet spot where railroads could standardize around it without feeling trapped. If a unit goes down, you can swap it with another similar unit. The consist still makes sense. The crew still knows what they're dealing with. The shop still has what it needs. And here's the detail that matters if you want to understand everything. A locomotive that becomes a standard becomes easier to keep alive because the railroad invests in the ecosystem around it. So the SD40-2 didn't just arrive reliable. It got more reliable over time because the whole industry built routines around it. That's what taking over actually means. It's not just popularity, it's infrastructure. Reason number 2, maintainability. The railroad version of easy to live with. Now reason number 2, maintainability. Let's say 2 locomotives pull the same train, same horsepower on paper, same job done. But one of them takes longer to troubleshoot, longer to access components, longer to repair, longer waiting for special parts. That locomotive is more expensive, even if it never fails catastrophically, because time in the shop is not neutral. Time in the shop is lost utilization. Every day a locomotive sits, the railroad still has to move freight, so it replaces that power with something else. It reshuffles assignments, it burns crew time, it creates delays that ripple through the network. That ripple is what kills the monster locomotive fantasy. The SD40-2 was built for the real world. The world where locomotives run hard, get dirty, get abused, and still need to be turned back out quickly. And when a railroad discovers a unit that's straightforward to keep running, they don't just like it, they scale it. Because easy to maintain doesn't just save money in the shop, it saves money everywhere. It simplifies training, it reduces downtime, it increases availability, and it reduces those ugly 3 a.m. surprises. This is why your last video matters too. The biggest diesel didn't take over because big concentrates risk and complexity. The SD40-2 took over because it spreads risk and simplifies complexity. That's a brutal trade, and it's why the boring machine wins. Reason number 3. Enough power that doesn't punish the railroad. Now, reason number 3 is the one people argue about at first, because it sounds like I'm saying power doesn't matter. Power matters. It just isn't the final boss. Here's the reality. Railroads don't want the most power. They want the most useful power per dollar. And useful includes things like fuel costs, wear, and how the locomotive behaves in a consist. If you can get the job done with power that's easier to manage, you'll choose that. The SD40-2 sits right in that zone, strong enough to do the work, common enough to be everywhere, compatible enough to mix with other units without drama. It's the locomotive equivalent of a hammer. Nobody writes songs about a hammer, but every house gets built with one. The moment it clicks, why you saw them everywhere. This is the part where the whole thing becomes obvious. Once a model becomes the safe choice, purchasing departments stop gambling. Because now the question isn't, what's the coolest new locomotive? The question becomes, why would we not buy more of what works? And once that mindset kicks in, it's over. That's how a locomotive takes over. Not by winning one race, by winning 10,000 boring days in a row. The best way to prove it, compare it to the more power temptation. All right, let's prove the SD40-2 story the simplest way possible. We compare it to the temptation every railroad faces. The temptation is always the same. More power, bigger numbers, stronger machine, that must be better. And in locomotive history, you can find that temptation everywhere. Sometimes it's a turbine, sometimes it's a steam monster, sometimes it's a giant one-off that looks like the future, and sometimes it's a similar diesel that promises more. Here's the thing, when you go from enough power to more power, you don't just add horsepower, you often add stress, you add heat, you add wear, you add parts that fail faster, and you add more time in the shop, so the decision becomes weirdly human. Do you want the strong, complicated friend, or the reliable friend who always shows up on time and never causes drama? Railroads choose the drama-free friend. That's why the SD40-2 didn't just beat competitors, it beat the railroad's own desire to chase the bigger number. The SD40-2 cheat code was not magic, it was trust. There's a business concept that matters here: trust. When a railroad trusts a locomotive model, everything gets easier. Dispatchers trust it. They plan around it. They assign it confidently. They know what it can do on a grade. They know how it behaves in the cold. They know how it responds in a consist. And shops trust it even more. They know the parts. They know the common failures. They know the fixes that work. They know the weird quirks that don't show up in manuals. That trust turns into speed, and speed turns into availability, and availability turns into money. So the SD40-2 wasn't just a locomotive, it was a locomotive that earned institutional confidence. That is a massive competitive advantage. Because once confidence is built, switching to something new isn't exciting anymore. Switching becomes risky. And railroads are not in the business of taking risks for fun. They take risks only when they have to. Why it survived for decades. The afterlife matters. Now here's something that really separates an industry standard from a cool experiment. An industry standard has an afterlife. It doesn't just run when it's new, it keeps running. It gets rebuilt, it gets reassigned, it gets repurposed. It shows up on short lines, it shows up on locals, it shows up in yards, it shows up everywhere. That's another reason you keep seeing SD40-2s long after their prime era. Because the support network for them is huge. Parts are out there. Knowledge is out there. People know how to work on them. And that means the SD40-2 isn't just economical when you buy it, it's economical for the entire lifespan. And in railroading, lifespan is everything. This is not consumer electronics, this is not upgrade every 2 years. A locomotive is a long-term asset, so when a model proves it can be maintained, rebuilt, and kept useful for decades, it becomes the safest purchase in the room. That safety is what "took over" actually means. The boring truth. Economics beats romance every time. Let's make this painfully clear. The SD40-2 won because it made the railroad's life easier. It made planning easier. It made maintenance easier. It made training easier. It made parts stocking easier. It made swapping power easier. It made operating costs more predictable. And predictable costs are gold, because predictable costs let you schedule. They let you promise service. They let you price contracts. They let you run a network without constantly improvising. That's why monster locomotives are usually a side story. They're romantic. They're iconic. They're the stuff you put on posters. But the locomotives that run the country are usually the ones that do boring work, reliably. The SD40-2 is basically the blue-collar legend of American railroading. No flash, all function. So now I want to hear from you. If you were running a railroad, what matters more? Would you rather have one monster unit that looks unstoppable, or a fleet of standard units that keep showing up every day with fewer surprises? Comment monster or fleet and tell me why. And if you want the perfect follow-up after this video, watch these next. First, America's biggest diesel locomotive and why it didn't take over. That's the contrast story. Then, why turbine locomotives failed. Because it's the same trap, different machine. And finally, steam versus diesel, the economics that changed railroads. Because that's the big picture. That's the moment the industry chose reliability over romance. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.